Hello friends, Pastor Will here for the final chapter of Ruth, the book of Ruth, for the message for November 22nd, 2020. Instead of praying at the beginning of this message, I'll be praying at the end, but I do pray God's blessings upon this interpretation. So Ruth 4, the whole book of Ruth is about redemption, but Ruth 4 brings it home. And we see that Ruth 4 in the book of Ruth, redemption recurs through an unconventional process in which people, property, prestige, all of this is restored to a family that has lost everything through poor circumstance, through poverty, through violence, all these things. These are the same things that occur in our society today. People lose prestige and power, property. They lose hope through violence, through war, through poverty, which is violence, through the institutional poverty, which is kept in place and is violent and is a sin and is the normal way that, at least that our nation, conducts business. These kind of things. So this text is very pertinent to our society and to especially to the people of God living in this society. There's a great word here that is being spoken to us, and we are wise to listen. So to redeem someone or something is to rescue them or to save them or to liberate them from danger and distress or oppression and hopelessness and despair. So in this final chapter, we learn that Naomi has some property that needs to be redeemed. But through this process of redeeming the property, Naomi is redeemed. And to be redeemed is to be brought back to wholeness. So being whole is crucial for a healthy living. To be whole is to live with integrity. And living with integrity is only possible through proper relationships with one another, including the sacred. We tend to think today that living with integrity means being a pillar of the community. Furthermore, we tend to define pillars of communities not by their character, but by their accumulation of wealth. If you look at boards of directors, whether they're boards of multinational billion-dollar corporations or boards of small nonprofits in small towns, everyone always wants the wealthiest people on these boards, as if that denotes character, which many times it does not. And especially according to Jesus, Jesus doesn't put a lot of faith into the wealthy because they don't tend to treat the poor well. In fact, our society has become so twisted and sick that we tend to value everything by money. If someone sees that you have something, if you show a friend of yours something that you collect or something that means a lot to you, we tend to value it. How much is it worth? How much can you get for it? Instead of just saying, wow, that's wonderful. I'm glad it gives you enjoyment, whatever it is. We always determine value by money. Have you ever thought about how sick that is? Integrity has nothing to do with these things. It has to do with one's character. And this character is always determined by how we relate to other people. So in chapter 4, we learn what it means to be complete or whole or to have integrity, however you want to say it. We learn what really counts in life. So the book focuses on the redemption of property that belonged to Naomi's deceased husband, but this is just a way to drive the true plot or the meaning of the story, which has to do with the meaning of life. What gives one meaning in life? What does it mean to have or live a fulfilled life? How does one live and build a healthy community? So, and before I forget, to be redeemed or to redeem something is to acquire it. So what is acquired or gained in this story? In this book of Ruth, we have seen and we see the peaceable community as defined by the kingdom of God in microcosm. This small community shows us what it means to live as the community of God, as the people of God. We see how the people of God, the church, are supposed to conduct our affairs And we see that this process differs greatly from how the church actually acts today. The church places everything that it does basically on money. And it's sick. So, we look at the beginning of chapter 4, verse 1. We see this, the setting is in public. It's the town gate. Boaz has promised Ruth and Naomi that he would redeem the land and marry Ruth. So he goes down to the town gate and he gathers 10 elders of the town to be his witnesses. Now, and the gate area of these ancient towns had benches all around the area where people were going to and from, going about their business and conducting business. And they could come and sit down on these benches and conduct their business or conduct legal matters. Legal matters could be discussed and witnessed. And this is what Boaz has done. This is a judicial proceeding. We see this in other places in the Bible, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Amos, other places. If you want to know where, ask. Boaz sits at the gate and he sees the next closest kin, the kin who is the relative who is closer to Naomi's deceased husband than Boaz is. That closest kin has the right to the land before Boaz. That's the way it is. That's the custom. That's the law. So Boaz sees this guy and calls him over to talk. And Boaz convenes a court of law. And he's doing all this to keep the oath he made to God in chapter 3, verse 13. Now, you've got to admire Boaz. He's keeping his word. He's keeping his oath. Don't go there, William. So he assembles 10 elders as witnesses, and we see that these elders take this seriously. And we see through this process that the fate of a foreign woman and an impoverished woman are of great importance to the community and to their wholeness and their integrity. This is important to them. These nobody women who show up in their midst have worth. They're not to be ignored. They're not to be avoided. They're not to be neglected. Not by people who take their relationship with God seriously. So for those who take their relationship with God seriously, the well-being of people on the margins of society, on the margins of communities, is important. They're not to be ignored. They're not to be pushed to the side. They're not to be exploited. They take the situation seriously and they act for their best interest. This means, of course, if we were to see that in our own society, this means, let's just say that we'll just use the little town of Bethlehem where this occurred. There are no walls around the city of Bethlehem. There are no caging of families who come from other countries. There's no withholding of necessities. There's no demeaning people not like themselves. The gathering of these 10 witnesses represents the whole community. And at the end of the legal proceeding, the whole community joins in and represent the whole people of God in congratulating Boaz and Ruth on their upcoming marriage. So, in verses 1 and 2, the closer kin, Boaz sees so-and-so and calls him over. He's just called so-and-so. He's not given a name. Why isn't he given a name? Because it doesn't matter. We see as the story progresses that so-and-so refuses to redeem the land and accept Ruth as in marriage. So-and-so, at first he's willing to take the land when he doesn't know about Ruth. He's willing to take the land because it will just wholly benefit him. But when he realizes, there's something included in the matter that will cost me, I don't want to be a part of it. And so he declines the offer. He declines to redeem. And so his name is lost to obscurity. When we, as God's people, refuse to act on behalf of people in need, our names are eventually lost to the ages. We are nothing. This is true whether we're an individual, a people, a community, or a nation. People who refuse to help others in their greatest need are nothing. Eventually, they cease to exist, which is the biblical definition of hell. The biblical definition of hell is annihilation, ceasing to exist. So-and-so ceases to exist. It was his right not to redeem. Legally, he did nothing wrong. What about ethically? The land needs to be bought back and restored to the family of Naomi's deceased husband. This land was probably sold during the time of famine when they moved to Moab. Either the land was sold or the rights to use the land were sold. We really don't know. We don't know enough about this. So-and-so may have claimed and used the land while Naomi and her family were away, since he was next of kin, since he was closest kin. If this is so, Boaz is suggesting that so-and-so pay Naomi for his use of the field for all those years. We know 10 years have passed. There are many unknowns in how this process worked. We don't know how Naomi had control over her deceased husband's land and how she can sell it. Why are she and Ruth impoverished if Naomi has land from which a product can come? We don't know. What is at stake for the closer kinsman? What is at stake for so-and-so? Is his a legal or a moral obligation? What would it cost him if he were to acquire the land and Ruth? We don't know. And why is acquiring Ruth even connected to redeeming the land? Again, we don't know. We don't know any of this. However, we live under the assumption that all land belongs to God and is held in trust by members of the community, by members of Israel. This is the assumption. Israel kept up with who owned what land. It was a sacred trust. God gave the land to Israel, and they took it seriously, and they monitored who owned it and who it went to and all this and that. How the land was used had to do with one's faith, just like how budgets are used in churches clearly shows whether a church is faithful or not. If they spend all their money on themselves, they're not faithful. If they take risk and get down to having just pennies left on the dollar, let's say, or even if they have a multi-million-dollar trust, but they're using all of it to serve those in need, they're faithful. A friend of mine's a pastor in West Virginia, small churches who have inherited lots of coal money, and they have millions of dollars. I know one small church, I preached a revival at his church, and he showed me they had several $1 million in their banking account, but they wouldn't spend a penny of it on the community. That's not the church. That's just a club. Very possibly in this story, I want to say his name, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, sold the land or its use before departing to Moab. And Naomi now has the right to buy back what was sold, but cannot afford to do so. Naomi is selling her right to purchase the land or to purchase the right to use the land. And so a redeemer is being sought out who is a family member so that that land can stay in the same family, and this will honor that family and the deceased husband's name. That's what's going on. Either way, whether the land was sold, whether the land is to be redeemed or the rights to use the land are to be redeemed, Naomi is too impoverished to benefit or to acquire the land. She doesn't have the means to acquire it. I think of all the Native Americans in this land and all the African Americans who were stolen from their lands, the Native Americans pushed from their lands, impoverished people. When the government today takes our lands, takes people's lands, eminent domain, all these cruel, hateful, evil, sinful things, we can relate. It's still going on today. Taking advantage of people when they lack resources. This is set up, this redemption of the land is set up in a way to try to help people not be taken advantage of. And so people are stepping in to redeem the land for Naomi. So, in order for the property to remain in Naomi's deceased husband's family, there needs to be a male heir to inherit it. Okay? Naomi can't inherit it. She's a woman. Not like that. Not for it to continue. So in verse 4, we see that Boaz tells so-and-so, uncover your ear. Listen to what I'm saying to you. I got something to tell you. Listening is the first step. Listening is the first step in moving toward being restored. It's the first step in moving toward recovery. I used to work in restorative justice. And in restorative justice, which is not the same as criminal justice. In criminal justice, we just focus on punishing people. In restorative justice, which is biblical, we focus on restoring people, victims and offenders alike. That doesn't mean the offenders aren't held accountable. They are held accountable. But there's still the possibility of restoration, of wholeness, of living with integrity. And the first step in restorative justice, first step toward healing and restoration is always listening. And we have certain ways of doing that so that people would listen. Both victims and offenders could listen. Both those who were upset and those who were not as involved. Everyone would listen and come to understand. And in restorative circles, in restorative justice, we would have restorative circles where all participants sat in a circle and there was a talking piece, and the talking piece could be anything. It could be a pen. And whoever held the talking piece could speak. No one else could speak. No one could interrupt. And then whoever was speaking would pass the talking piece in one direction. It was always one direction to the next person. And let's say someone 5 people down, when let's say the guy who had offended started talking about why he offended, and the guy 6 people down the row were like, no, I disagree. I want to say something. I've got to say something and tell you off. But they couldn't because they didn't have the talking piece. So they had to wait in agony while the talking piece went from person to person to person. And during that interim, if that 5th person was smart, they would not just sit there and stew and think about their rebuttal. They would listen to everyone speak. And through that process, they may come to an understanding they never considered before. And by the time it got to them, they may have actually changed their mind. And go, oh my God, I never looked at it that way. If all these other different people hadn't contributed, I never would have thought about that. If I hadn't listened, I never would have considered that. The first step toward restoration, listening, including ourselves being restored before God, listening to God saying, you are my beloved. I love you. Now listen to everything else I say to you, God says, through that lens, through those ears of I love you. And then you can move toward restoration in your own life instead of thinking God is out to condemn you, because God isn't out to condemn you. God is out to love you. You're beloved. So in restorative justice, we see a godly process. In criminal justice, quite honestly, we see an evil process. When we desire to punish people for their actions and their mistakes, we step outside of the realm of God. God doesn't desire to punish us. God desires to restore us. And when we just focus on punishing, you see this a lot in politics. People get elected because they're going to be hard on the criminals. They're going to punish them. That's outside the realm of God's thinking. God is interested in restoration, in redemption, not in punishing, not in judging, not in condemning. So, in this legal proceeding at the city gate, Boaz publicly calls so-and-so to account. So-and-so, you have the opportunity to help these impoverished women. Are you going to take that opportunity or not? Initially, so-and-so says, yeah, I'll redeem the land. I'll buy it. Yeah, man. I've been using it anyway. Yeah, I'll take it. People initially say they want a relationship with God when they think it's about heaven and hell. Christians for so long think that being a disciple is about being saved from hell, but it's not. Those are very selfish reasons for wanting to follow God. Very, very selfish, and opposed from the invitation of discipleship, which is just to be loved and to love. But people generally want to sign up with the God thing when they think it's all about them. It's about my personal relationship with Jesus. Yes, Jesus is going to save me. And so a lot of people who masquerade as Christians, we realize, are just self-serving, selfish people. They joined up for what's in it for them, and they become upset when they learn that it's not about that. That following God is about self-sacrifice. Following God is about the greater community and everyone benefiting in that greater community. Following God is never about self-preservation. So at first, so-and-so says, yeah, I'll take the land, no problem. But then, it's like that guy, Admiral somebody on Star Wars, the first one, which was really episode 4. When he says, "It's a trap." Remember that? It's a trap. He's become famous for that. It's a trap. Because then Boaz cleverly says, "Great, you'll take the land." And of course, with the land comes Ruth, and by implication, Naomi, her mother-in-law. They come with the land. And when so-and-so hears the full terms that he must also acquire Ruth, he backs out of the deal. "Oh no, that's going to cost me too much," he says. "That's going to be an economic hardship." We don't know why. The closer kin agrees to redeem Naomi's land until he learns that Ruth, the Moabite, the foreigner, is a part of the deal. It reminds me of the baptism of the Emperor Constantine when he decided that God would be good for business in the empire. And so he just told God, if I win so-and-so battle, I'll acknowledge that you're the God of gods, and I will follow you, and I will have all my soldiers baptized into your way. But they're going to hold their sword arms out of the water. Their sword arms are going to be held out of the water. They'll be baptized, they'll be immersed into the water, but not their arm that holds their sword, because that belongs to me. And we're going to kill them all. You can figure it out, God. We're going to kill all of our enemies. We're not going to give you that. It's just like Christians today. When we're baptized, we go, "Oh, God, we want to be covered in your love, but we're going to hold our debit card out of the water. Let's hold that out. Not going to allow it to be put into the baptism. Hold it out because, God, the money belongs to me." We don't really know why so-and-so doesn't want Ruth or what it'll cost him. If he accepts the land but not Ruth, he loses the respect of the community. And so he says no. He'd rather have that respect. We'll go to great lengths to keep the respect of the community, even if it's opposed to what God is calling us to do. So then in verses 7 through 10, the decision is formally declared. The next of kin removes his sandal. "I don't have a sandal, I have a shoe." And he places it under the thigh of Boaz. And then the narrator of the story tells all those who are, listening to the story that this is an ancient custom that was done in ancient times, which tells us that this story was told way after the fact of the story. It's told a long time later, and the people didn't understand that custom anymore, just like we don't. Giving up this sandal signifies his giving up the right to the land. We see something very similar in Deuteronomy 25, verse 9. Boaz declares the content of the transaction to the witnesses, saying, "Today you are the witnesses," and we know this is a legal proceeding, this is a legal narrative. And then the witnesses in verses 11 through 12 acknowledge the arrangement and bless Boaz in his upcoming marriage to Ruth. And then the whole community turns out. The text says all of the people of the village bless Boaz and Ruth both and express that Ruth will fulfill the same role as Rachel and Leah in days gone by. What was the role of Rachel and Leah? Married to Jacob. Their role was to build up the house of Israel. Jacob sought out Rachel and Leah to be his wives solely because they were Hebrews. They were Israelites, whatever you want to say. He sought them out because they were not foreigners. He wanted non-foreigners to be his wives. That's why he sought them out. And they were to build up the house of Israel. Look in Genesis 28. Now, Israel is saying that Ruth will have that same role to build up the house of Israel. And this is incredible because Ruth is a foreigner from a nation that's an enemy of Israel. This is earth-shattering, revolutionary, or evolutionary. A foreigner has the same rights and honor as Rachel and Leah and will fulfill the same role. Oh my God. That'd be like saying a Mexican is going to save America. What What's the use of that wall? Are you crazy? The townspeople conclude their blessings with references to Perez, P-E-R-E-Z, who is a son, twin son, no less, of Tamar and Judah. Remember I talked about Tamar and Judah last week? Tamar was the daughter-in-law to Judah, and she had been denied justice by Judah, and so she tricked him and pretended she was a prostitute, and he slept with her, and then she had a baby, and then he condemned her for being such a whore. That's what it actually says in the Bible. And then she put out items of his that he had given to her when they were together, and he realized, oh, she's a better person than I am. I am to be condemned. I denied her justice. That's the boy who was born to them. And and by their mentioning him, this points to the genealogy at the end of the chapter at 18 through 22, where we learn that this boy, Perez, is the ancestor of Boaz and David, who becomes king. And then subsequently, through the line of David, we got the line of Boaz to David, and then the line of David to Jesus. And in Matthew 1:1, we see the long list of the male ancestors of Jesus. And this long list of male ancestors includes 4 women, only 4, all mothers. Tamar, Ruth, not Naomi, Rahab, who we're told there is the mother of Boaz, but we're not told that in the Old Testament, and Bathsheba, who is the mother of Solomon, and who was also the mistress of David, and later his wife. And this is all done to introduce Mary in Matthew, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who acts well outside the social norms of what is expected in proper community, which leads to the birth of Jesus, which leads to the mission to the Gentiles, the foreigners, and not just the house of Israel, and which leads to the inclusion of the early church, extending a welcome to worship with them to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. Think about it. In verse 13, Ruth and Boaz marry. They conceive a child. They give birth to a male child. The birth of this child is attributed to God. It says the Lord made her conceive, just like it says of Rachel and Leah, the Lord made them conceive. So the story begins with the Lord acting. There's only 2 times where God interacts or intervenes in the human history or in human activity in the book of Ruth. At the beginning, when we're told that God gave food to the people in Bethlehem, which caused Naomi to say, I'm going to return to Bethlehem. And then here, where God causes Ruth to conceive and have a baby. God directly intervenes. And in both cases, God reverses a condition that humans on their own could not do. They could not accomplish this. Now remember, Ruth could have been married to her former husband, Mahlon, for at least 10 years, or as much as 10 years, and hadn't produced a child. But now, through the actions of God, she's able to produce a child. That's what the story says. So we see that God acts on behalf of others and sets opportunities in motion all the way through the story. But God is relying on human beings to act on behalf of each other as well, so that God's purposes can be accomplished. So then at the end of the chapter, in verses 14 through 17, the women of Bethlehem again gather around Naomi like they did at the beginning of the story. At the beginning of the story, they gather around Naomi. Naomi speaks and says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Bitter. I'm bitter, that's my name. But in this story, at the end, the women are all gathered around Naomi and they're all joyous. This is a time and a moment of great joy. Naomi has been restored. Naomi doesn't speak, but the women speak in joy. And the women realize, despite all this talk about property rights all the way through the book of Ruth, property rights and money and value and who gets what, the women realize the real value of anything in life is relationships. Naomi is redeemed. She is fulfilled. She is brought to completion again because Ruth has a baby that is her grandchild and she gets to love and take care of. Human relationships are the meaning of life. These women are concerned with the emotional and spiritual condition of Naomi. I was in Walmart yesterday and I saw this big sign, perhaps you've seen it, and it says, "Save money, enjoy life." Again, we've so equated life and the value of life and the enjoyment of life with money. And we look at that and we think it's true, we think it's real, and it's just a lie. It's a lie. The fulfillment of life has nothing to do with money. Nothing. Could we be happier with money? Perhaps. Could life be easier? Probably. But it doesn't bring fulfillment. Life is not about money, life or property, or however you want to put it, wealth. Life is about caring for others and being secure in our relationships. We can be secure because we know that it is through loving, caring relationships with others that we are secure in our relationship with God. Jesus tells us that when someone asks him, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, the greatest commandment is to love God with every sinew of your being, everything that you have and are and hope to be. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, everything. How? Love others the way you want to be loved. Love your neighbor as yourself. Our security comes from proper relationships with God and other people. Proper relationships with God are always measured by taking care of others in our community. Always. Ruth is no longer ignored in the conversation of the women. She's highlighted. She's praised. She's praised as being more valuable than 7 sons. 7 was a magic number in ancient days. It was the number of idealized perfection. This is to say that Ruth is better than 7 sons is the highest compliment that could ever be given to her. Ever. No wonder that later it's not Naomi but Ruth who is recognized as one of the mothers in the ancestry of the Messiah. And we see at the end of the story that God's treatment of Naomi is much different from her perception of how God cared about her. She didn't think God cared much about her at all at the beginning of the story. But now we see that God was very present with her the entire time. Even when she felt most abandoned and in despair, God was still there working for her betterment, working for the best for her, and depending on the community to show